Okay, so the first thing we want to go through with this video is just some of the wording that you're going to come across with regards income tax questions. So firstly, we have gross income, gross wage, gross salary, or gross earnings. So that's always the total you earn before any deduction. Gross always means the total, okay? Before you start taking away anything, you're going to have your gross. So income, wage, salary, and earnings are all money that you earn. So all different ways of saying that. Net income, net wage, net salary, net earnings. Then if you're using the word net, this is actually how much you're going to get, okay? Because just because you might earn a certain amount of money, gross earnings, you have all sorts of deductions to take away from that. The tax, PRSI, any kind of things like that need to be deducted from it. And so it's different to what you're actually going to take home. So another thing actually that we can add to that is take home pay. Net income, net wage, net salary, net earnings, and take home pay. That's all the same thing. That's how much you actually get. Tax then, well, when you calculate your tax, it's always a percentage. It's always a percentage calculation, and that's always something then you will subtract. It's a deduction, so you'll subtract that always from a gross income. Gross tax then is the total tax before you subtract the tax credit. Now, if you have a tax credit, that means there's a certain amount then of tax that you don't have to pay, okay? Tax is a payment. As I said, it's calculated as a percentage of your wages. Gross tax is the total tax calculation. But if you have a tax credit, you always can subtract that. So if you go down to the next one, tax credit, you always subtract this from the gross tax. If you have a tax credit, then you have less tax to actually pay. So you can deduct this from the tax that you owe. Then we have a standard rate cutoff point. So this is the amount of wages that is taxed at the lower rate of tax. So when you get into the higher level questions, you have more complexity in how you work out your tax, okay? So the standard rate cutoff point is the amount of wages that gets taxed at the lower rate. Any wages then that you earn above this amount, that gets taxed at the higher rate of tax. And usually those details are in the question. Then USC and PRSI, they're also calculations that are worked on, the percentage calculations, okay? So percentage of your earnings, that's how you work it out, you get the percentage. They're also things that are deducted from your gross salary, okay? Things that you have to take away to find your take-home pay. Okay, so we're going to jump straight into an example now. So in this question, we have that a printer has a weekly wage of 800 euros. He pays income tax on all his wages. So the whole thing has got to be used in the calculation here at the standard rate of 20%. So that's the calculation. That's the percentage calculation is 20% of 800. Okay, that's how we work out our tax. It's always a percentage of the wages. If he has a tax credit of 48 euros a week, find out how much income tax he pays. Now, the thing with these questions is that they're always wording. So you always want to read it a couple of times before you make a start, okay? Because it's very easy to miss a key bit of information if you jump straight into the calculations. Read the question, I would suggest about 3 times before you put pen to paper. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to work out the percentage, okay? Tax, as I said, is always worked out as a percentage of your wages. So we're going to get 20% of 800 euros. Okay? So the easiest way to do that is to do 800 times 0.20. That's 20% as a decimal. And I'll do that on the calculator. It's 160 euros. So that is the gross tax, okay? The total tax before any deductions. And deductions from tax might be a tax credit, which is, of course, what I have here. If he has a tax credit of 48 euros, that means he doesn't have to pay 48 euros of the 160. So we'll always subtract, you always subtract a tax credit from the gross tax. It is very useful to label your calculations here so you know and the examiner knows what you're trying to get and work out, okay? So you always subtract your tax credit from the gross tax, and that leaves you with 112 euros, which is going to be the tax he pays. And that's actually as far as we need to go here because that's what they asked you for. Okay, let's have a look at the next question. A woman's income for the year is 45,000. The standard rate cutoff is 35,300 and she has a tax credit of 4,000. If the standard rate of tax is 20% and the higher rate is 40%, how much income tax does she pay for the year? Now, we're just asked about the income tax, okay? We have the income, 45,000, and we have the standard rate cutoff point, 35,300. Now, if you remember from your notes, the standard rate cutoff point is the amount that's taxed at the lower rate, okay? So the 35,300 is going to be at the 20%, all right? Now, given that there's a higher rate of tax, how much money she earns above 35,300 is what needs to be taxed at 40%. So that's my standard rate of tax. I'll then have to add on the higher rate of tax, but that's what I need to work out next. Well, if 35,300 has already been taxed, to find out how much is left from a salary of 45,000, left still to be taxed, I'm going to do 45,000 subtract the 35,300, and that's going to be at the higher rate of tax, okay? So if you've already taxed 35,300, which is what I'm doing here, your standard rate cutoff point is always taxed at the lower rate. Then to see how much she earns above that, subtract it from the total salary to see how much is left to be taxed. And that's how you figure out what's to be taxed at the higher rate. Okay, so now the calculation for the lower rate of tax, I want 20%, so I'm going to multiply by the decimal. Okay. Then I want to calculate the balance that needs to be taxed at the higher rate of tax. So I'm going to do 45,000, subtract 35,300, and I'm getting 9,700. So it's 9,700 then, that's going to be taxed at 40%. And the decimal of that is 0.40. Okay, so there are my calculations. And these calculations are going to get me the gross tax. Okay, so I'm going to do 35,300 times 0.2. And that's 7,060. 9,700 times 0.4. 3,880. Add them together. And I'm getting 10,940. And as I said, that is the gross tax. Okay, that's all my tax calculations to figure out the total tax. Now, go back to your question. There's a tax credit of 4,000. And what do you always do with a tax credit? You always subtract a tax credit from the gross tax. So when you subtract your 4,000 there, we're left with 6,940. And that is the net tax, in other words, the tax that she will actually pay. And that's as far as we need to go because that's all they asked for in this question. The tax that she actually pays. And once I've got the total tax, subtracted the tax credit, I've figured out the tax that she actually has to pay. Okay, so here's a question. After the previous two examples that we've just done, why don't you press pause on this one and see how you get on your own. Okay, so Leah has a weekly wage of €750. Her weekly tax credit is 72. There's a standard rate of tax of 25%. And we want to know how much income tax she pays each week. So there's just a standard rate. There's no higher rate. That detail isn't given in this question. So we have to take it. There's just a standard rate of tax. Tax is always a percentage calculation. So I just want 25% of the wages, which of course is 750. So to get the 25%, I'm going to multiply by the decimal. So I've got 750 times 0.25, which works out to be 187.50. Now that's the gross tax. We have a tax credit. We always subtract a tax credit from gross tax. And we end up with 115.50. And that's the net tax, in other words, the tax she actually pays. And that's all we were asked for in this question. Okay, now let's try this question. Have a read through. Again, if you feel confident, press pause and try it yourself first before you press play and watch the solution. So Angela has an annual salary of 46,000. Her standard rate cutoff point is 35,300 and her tax credit is 3,200. If the standard rate of income tax is 20% and the higher rate is 40%, we need to find the gross income tax for the year and the amount of income tax paid for the year. Okay, so they want two things. They want the gross tax and then the tax that they're going to actually pay. Angela's actually going to pay. Okay, so this time we do have a standard rate cutoff point. So that's always your first thing. The standard rate cutoff point is 35,300 again. That's always at the lower rate. And to find out how much she earns then at the higher rate, I have got to take that away from the salary to see how much money she earns above 35,300. So I'll take her annual salary, take away the money that she's already taxed at the lower rate, and that's what's going to be at the higher rate of tax, the 40%. Okay, so those calculations, 35,300, I'm going to get 20% of that by multiplying by the decimal. And then I've got 46,000, subtract 35,300, and that gives me 10,700, and that's at the higher rate, so 40% multiplied by the decimal, 0.40. Okay, so now to work out those calculations, this works out to be 7060, and 10,700 at 40% works out to be 4280. Add them together and I get 11,340. Now, that's your gross tax. And get into the habit of labeling these because then it becomes really clear when you've realized you've answered part of the question. But it's a really good idea to do this structure and to continue to do the same structure because then if you're missing any bits of information or you get a little muddled up with what they're actually asking for, you've got everything labeled and clearly there anyway. It's just really good structure for yourself to get into. So that's actually the answer to part I. Now I'm going to find the tax that she actually pays. So if that's the gross tax, what we always do, of course, then with the other last bit of information I haven't used yet is, of course, the tax credit. And you always subtract a tax credit from your total tax. And again, it's useful to label that there for yourself. And so taking away the tax credit, we are left with 8,140. And that is the net tax, or in other words, the tax she pays. And that's part 2. Okay, here's a very similar question. So why don't you press pause here and see how far you can get in this one on your own. Okay, so we have Neve with an annual salary of 48,000. Standard rate cutoff point is 34,000 and there's a tax credit of 4,600. We have the standard rate of tax 20% and the higher rate 40%. Now just be careful there. They can differ ever so slightly, so just don't make any assumptions. Always make sure you're using the exact percentage detail that they're given in the question, because sometimes that might be 20%, might be 22%, or 40%, 41%, 42%. So just be careful. Just don't make any assumptions by jumping straight into questions and assuming your standard rate is going to be 20%. Just double check that is the detail in the question. Okay, so in this case, we have our standard rate cutoff point is always at our lower rate of tax. And now, how much more money beyond 34,000 does she earn? Because that's going to be at the higher rate of tax, 40%. So I'm going to do 48,000, take away what we've already taxed, and that's going to be at the higher rate of 40%. Okay, this is how I'm going to calculate my gross tax. So the calculation for this is going to be multiplied by 0.20, and write that out because that calculation there is going to get you marks in a mark scheme, okay? The examiner's going to want to see exactly what it is that you're typing in on the calculator. All right, so get into the habit of laying this out, as I said, in the same way every time and with this extent of detail, okay? All right, so subtract the 34,000, that leaves me with 14,000 that's left to be taxed at 40%. And so for that, I'm going to multiply by the decimal 0.40. So now 34,000 times 0.20 is 6,800 and 14,000 times 0.4 is 5,600. Add those two together and I'm getting 12,400, which is my gross tax. Now, the detail, of course, I haven't used yet is that there's a tax credit here of 4,600, and we always subtract the tax credit from the gross tax. So I'm going to subtract my 4,600 from my 12,400, and I'm getting 7,800. And that is, of course, my net tax, or in other words, the tax she pays. And that's what I've been asked for here. Now, at this point, I just want to add in a little something, okay? I'm going to add in a little detail to this question, just so you can just see there can be an added extra detail with questions often. Up to now, we've only been asked about the tax, right? Either the gross tax or the tax that's actually paid. But you can often be asked to then find her take-home pay. Okay, in other words, her net income or net salary. Okay, so if you remember back from your little definitions at the start, the take-home pay or net income net salary is how much she earns after all the deductions. Okay, now there's only one major deduction that we've had to work out here, that is the tax. That's the only tax amount that she pays. So go back to how much she earns, 48,000, okay? Subtract the tax that she's paying, which is only 7,800. And what you're left with then is 40,200. That's obviously the net income, okay? So it's the gross salary. Once you take away the tax that she has to pay, then you're left with how much money she actually gets to take home. In other words, her net salary or net income. Is that all right? So just watch out for that extra detail that can often come up in questions. And I just wanted to touch on it here as we were working through that example. Okay, so the next question I want to look at here is a question on the universal social charge. So here are the income thresholds for 2019, and in this table gives all the details of how we calculate the USC. Okay, and the details in this table then doesn't tend to change from one question to another. All right, so how we interpret this table, though, that's the key thing. Now, I'm not going to do all of these, but we are going to have a look at the first one. All right, so again, these are just a number of different questions, just getting it used to calculating the USC using the calculations in the table. We're going to have a look at the first one. Aidan has an annual salary of 57,000, and we need to calculate his USC for the year. Now, USC, once you figure out how much it is just another deduction. So you'll have your tax deduction and you'd have a USC deduction. And all I need to work out here is, using this table, what actually is his USC charge for the year. So given that we're talking about an annual salary, we're only interested then in the information along here per year. If you notice there in the second question, it's to do with the weekly wage. And if you're doing it with the weekly wage, you're going to look at the USC in terms of per week. So you look at these values here, okay? We're just doing part I with Aidan here, so we're just looking at these ones. He earns 57,000. Now, what this means here is that the first 12,012 euros that Aidan earns is taxed at 0.5%, okay? If he earns above that amount, then anything earned above that amount but less than 19,874 is taxed at 2%. If he earns above 19,874, then any amount of money earned above 19,874 but less than 70,044, which this is, whatever's the remainder then is calculated at 4.5%. And if he earned more than 70,044, it would be it would be calculated 8%. Now, in this case, Aidan doesn't earn more than that, but he does earn up to 12,000, and I have to calculate the 0.5% rate on the first 12,012 euros that he earns. Okay, so 12,012 euros is at 0.5%. Okay, now next, he does earn above 12,012 and he earns above 19,874 as well. So that means any money earned between 12,012 and 19,874 has to be now taxed at 2%. So I'm going to subtract these two amounts to see how much money is that I'm talking about that he earns between those two figures, because however much he earns between those two values has to be taxed at 2%. So I'll do 19,874 subtract 12,012, and that'll be at 2%. Okay. Now, then, however much money he earns above the 19,874 is now is calculated at a rate of 4.5%. So we've already figured out he doesn't earn above that threshold, but he does earn above 19,874 because he earns 57,000 in total. So how much money above 19,874 does he actually earn? Well, let me do that subtraction. 57,000 subtract 19,874, and that's going to be taxed at the rate of 4.5%. Okay, so now all these calculations, that 12,012, now 0.5% as a decimal is 0.005, okay? Be careful, you're dividing by 100, okay? So it's going to be 0.005 is the calculation there. All right. Now, to calculate this, how much money is at 2%, I'm going to do 19,874, take away 12,012, and I'm getting 7,862. At 2% is the decimal 0.02. Now I'm going to do the calculation, 57,000, take away 19,874. Careful now on the calculator, it's so easy to type something in incorrectly. That's 37,126. At 4.5% is 0.045. Again, 4.5 divided by 100 is how you get from a percentage to a decimal. So that's how I'm getting 0.045. Right, so now I'm going to do all these calculations. So 12,012 times 0.005 is 60.06. 7862 times 0.02 is 157.24, and 37,126 times 0.045 is 1,670.67. And now add them all up, and I'm getting 1,887.97 in total. Okay, last question we're going to have a look at here. So in this question, we have a man pays 4,500 income tax for the year, and he has a tax credit of 2,400. If he pays tax at the standard rate of 20% on all his income, calculate his gross income for the year. Now, this is a bit different. We're not given his gross income, Okay, so we're going to kind of have to work backwards a little bit with this kind of question. If you feel confident, press pause and see how you get on with it if you like. But if not, listen carefully, and I'm going to go through now in detail how you can deal with a question like this where you're kind of missing pieces of information, and we're going to have to kind of bit by bit work our way backwards to figuring out what his actual gross income is. So what I would say with this, if you have continued with the structure and layout, it can be very useful because it kind of helps then figure out how you can work backwards to fill in any blanks. And I'm going to do this by taking the gross income. I don't know what that is, okay? I'm going to put that in as a blank box, all right? But I do know if I had his gross income and I was to get the 20% rate on all of that, what I would do with that amount of money that he earns, I'd get 20% of it. And how I'd get 20% is I would multiply that value by 0.20. And if I did that calculation, then I would work out his gross tax. Okay, because it is just 20% of all his income. Then what I would do with that value is, since there's a tax credit here of 2,400, I would get a value for that gross tax. And then I would subtract the tax credit. I always subtract tax credit from the gross tax. I just don't know what the gross tax is because I don't know what the gross income is. And then I would get the net tax or the tax he pays. And I know what that is. I know that that is 4,500. Okay? So now you kind of have it all laid out for yourself. It's going to be quite easy to figure out how to work backwards to fill in your blanks, okay? Because if you've subtracted 2,400 to get 4,500 to work backwards, I'm just going to add that back on. So in other words, 4,500, add on the tax credit. That must mean that 6,900 was the gross tax. Now, something multiplied by 0.20 gave me the 6,900. So again, if I want to work backwards to find out what was that original amount in there, that when I multiply it by 0.20, I get the gross tax of 6,900. If I want to work backwards, instead of multiplying by 0.20, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to divide by 0.20. So 6,900 divide by 0.20, and I'm getting 34,500. And that, of course, is the gross income. So do you see the way sometimes the layout can really help you figure out what you need to do to work backwards to get a missing piece of information, and what you need to do with that to work backwards to get right back to the start. And you can figure out then piece by piece that missing piece of information that you usually have at the start of the question.